Hey guys, it's Miss Monroe again, and this is a video for Tuesday, April 21st. I'm gonna tell you a little bit about a book that I read, which is called Chaotic Good. I don't have the book here because I actually donated it to the class library and I think somebody borrowed it. So whoever has that book, I hope that you have read it and enjoyed it because I thought it was pretty good. So I'm gonna show a picture of the cover instead. Here it is. So I read this book this year, a couple months ago, and I really liked it because it was about something that I don't often read books that are on the topic of fandom. And the main character of this novel is a young woman named Cameron, who's in her last year of high school and she's trying to prepare a portfolio to get into a fashion design program at Caltech. And a lot of her costumes revolve around fandom. So comic books, cosplay, characters from movies, like the Marvel Universe, for example. And she's really talented. And what I really liked about the story in general was that it involved things that just aren't in every book and stuff that I'm interested in as well. I know a lot of you guys are Marvel fans. At one point in the book, she makes a costume. So sometimes she's paid to make costumes for other people, and she's asked or commissioned to make the costume for a character called Quentin Quire. And I assumed it was a made-up character, but it turns out it's actually a Marvel character who's usually part of the X-Men, also known as Kid Omega. So I thought that was really cool. It was nice to learn about another character, and she describes the process of designing and creating this cosplay fashion for this commission. So that was really cool too. So the character of Cameron is a high school student, and she's obviously really talented at fashion design and creating costumes and cosplay things. Um, but the story actually revolves around her attempt to ingratiate herself with this group of guys who work at the local comic book store. And there's a little bit of Shakespeare's Twelfth Night in the story here because Cameron actually ends up disguising herself as a boy in order to infiltrate this kind of Dungeons and Dragons comic book world that's happening in this bookstore that she didn't really feel welcomed in as a woman. So there's a sort of disguising aspect. She uses obviously her skills in cosplay and costume design to realistically disguise herself as a boy and takes on the persona of her own twin brother. So all of that is pretty much straight out of Shakespeare's Twelfth Night. If you've never read that play or seen it, you may have seen the movie She's the Man, which is also based on Twelfth Night. And that's actually a really funny movie that I highly recommend if you've never watched it. The reason I like this book, mostly it's for the main character, because Cameron is really different from a lot of other characters that I've read about. I really love the relationship between her and her twin brother, Cooper. The characters at the comic book store, which a lot of the plot revolves around, they're not stereotypes. We have people who are really nuanced, characters who seem like they're really awful and then they don't turn out to be so bad. It's a very diverse group of characters. The whole story is quite LGBTQ friendly, which I liked. And as well, there's lots of references to kind of nerdy fandom things like comics, movies, and of course D&D. And the title Chaotic Good comes from Dungeons and Dragons originally. You might have heard of some of these ideas before. For example, lawful good, true neutral, chaotic evil, lawful evil. They're kind of a big part of internet meme culture, and it actually comes from Dungeons and Dragons. It's when you create your character, you can make your character good or evil or neutral or lawful or chaotic. So it all comes from there. And yeah, if you like fandom, I mean, I'm into some of that stuff like Star Trek and Star Wars. I like some Marvel and DC movies and characters. I love comic books. So I feel like this book was just really fun because it delves into that world. And it's about teenagers who are just really into those things as well. And it's about some of their interests. And I love that the main character was really complex and that it showed her talent. And it's a bit of a feminist book too, right? Because she's calling out the toxic masculinity that is inherent in this bookstore that she's just trying to be a part of, and the stereotypes and the issues that she encounters just for being a girl going into that space. And all those issues are addressed in the book. So I thought there was a lot there. It's not a serious book, but it does deal with some real issues. And I just thought it was a really enjoyable read. So if it sounds good, you can check it out. We're posting it for you. And be sure to read it if it sounds like it might be something that you're interested in. I forgot to mention as well that I purposely wore this Slytherin sweatshirt, speaking of fandom, because I love Harry Potter. And I'm in the Slytherin house. No big deal. Okay, so we're going to move on to the lesson part of today's lesson. And we're going to be looking at a short story by, once again, Langston Hughes, who was the poet and author that I covered in last week's lesson on dreams. So what I have for you, there's actually a video that had already been done of another teacher reading the story out loud. So in order for you to watch this video, you'll have to pause this one. And then if you go on the Google Classroom, you should see a link to both a PDF of the story and also to this video of the teacher reading it out. So that's the best way for us to actually access this story. You can read it on paper and or you can listen to the video. So we'll pause now and come back to this video when you've had a chance to look at the story, and we'll do a little bit of discussion about it. Okay, so I hope you enjoyed the story. It's a short one and only 3 pages, and it's what I like to think of as a slice of life or a snapshot of 2 characters. If we just want to look at it quickly in terms of on the lines, between the lines, and beyond the lines, if you look at this story just purely on a literal level, it's about an interaction between a teenage boy and this older woman, Mrs. Jones, and he tries to rob her and is unsuccessful. But we need to look deeper at this story in terms of what happens next. Just the irony in the between the lines reading of this. One would expect that if you were to try and rob somebody and they caught you, you were unsuccessful in your attempt, that probably you'd get into trouble, right? So there's situational irony in the way that the story plays out. For example, Mrs. Jones could have taken Roger down to the police station as he was afraid that she might. And instead, the central irony of the story is that she shows him forgiveness and she shows him dignity, so that the shame that he feels when he first tried to rob her and was caught, by the end of the story, that's all gone. And she's shown him grace, and she's shown him just a completely different outcome than what either he or the reader might have been expecting. So that's what we might call irony, in which the outcome of something is the opposite or just unexpected from where we thought it would go. In terms of beyond the lines, not only is this story ironic, but it also shows us deeper levels of morality. And there's hidden meanings in the story too. For example, the fact that Roger is a teenager, described as 14 or 15. He's described as thin and willowy, so there's some undercurrents there that perhaps he's underfed or even neglected. And why is he alone at night? And why is he trying to steal this woman's wallet and her purse? And also Mrs. Jones herself, who lives alone, and later in the story she describes that she's come home late from her job at a beauty parlor at a hotel. So she's basically working the night shift. So there's also this connection between the two of them. They're both out there alone at night. They're both vulnerable in their own ways. And instead of them being enemies at the end of the story, they've also become kind of allies. She's shown him another way of living that perhaps he didn't realize even existed. And when she gives him the $10 at the end of the story for these shoes that he had talked about wanting, she gives him this real gift. And I want you to think about as well the symbolism of that gift and of the blue suede shoes that Roger wanted to buy in the first place. What might those shoes represent? So there's some symbolism there with the shoes. There's situational irony in the story and the way that it plays out. And then there's these themes of forgiveness and dignity and grace that come through in the way that Mrs. Jones treats Roger. She teaches him many lessons, and all that she does is make him a hot meal. She shares some cake and a hot cocoa with him. And at the end of the story, she gives him some money. That's also ironic because in the beginning, of course, he tries to steal money from her. And at the end of the story, she gives it to him freely with no questions asked and basically tells him, go buy yourself something. And she says, shoes that you buy with stolen money will never feel good on your feet, that they're devilish, right? So she wants to give him something that's more pure and innocent the way that perhaps she views him, and that the mistakes that he's made are not the be all and end all. So there's something very satisfying about this interaction. Obviously, it's a situation in real life that could and probably would end quite badly. But this woman who shows this young man what dignity means and what forgiveness is makes the story quite a feel-good one. And you leave the story with the impression that Roger will follow her advice, that he won't be doing things like this again, that maybe he'll choose to make a positive change in his life. And that this one short dinner with this woman, even though he was physically dragged to her house, but that the lessons that she tries to teach him may have sunk in, and that interaction actually ended up being extremely important. So those are just some of the ideas that I came up with after reading the story. And I'm going to talk about a couple of other things that you could use as a quick write. If you feel the need at this point to perhaps listen to the story again or reread it from the PDF, it might be a good time. And you can look for some of these things, especially what the shoes might mean, and looking for the colloquial language that the author uses as well in the way that the two characters speak to each other in their dialogue. All right, so for our quick write today, I have a couple of options. The first one would be, again, more of a diary entry, nonfiction type of response, and then I have a creative option as well. So for the journal entry or nonfiction response, I want to talk about the theme of second chances. Because in the story Thank You Ma'am by Langston Hughes, the woman, Mrs. Jones, gives Roger a second chance. She could have called the police, she could have gotten him into trouble, and instead she gives him a second chance. She gives him forgiveness, she provides him even with some money, and she gives him another chance to make a different decision, right? To go down a different path. So for the diary entry, I want you to think about when was a time that somebody gave you a second chance? When was it that someone forgave you for something? Or you thought for sure, I'm going to be in trouble or this is going to be really bad. And instead you were surprised. Perhaps someone showed you that grace or forgiveness that is shown in the story. And I'd like you to think about that. And if there's something that comes to mind, then you can write about that. As another option for that nonfiction type of quick write, I want you to think about the symbol of the blue suede shoes that's in the story as well. So Roger is doing all this. He claims that he was trying to rob Mrs. Jones because he really wanted a pair of blue suede shoes. And she gives him the money later and says, why don't you go and buy those? So obviously the shoes in the story represent something more than just a pair of shoes, right? They might represent to Roger success, or, if I get those shoes, that's going to mean that I've made it, or that I'm a success. Like, it's really important to him. The shoes are more than just a pair of shoes. It means something much deeper to Roger. So if you were to think about what would be something, a symbol that represents you, what's something that's really important to you? What would be your blue suede shoes? What would be an object that you are really attached to that you think, if I have that, I'm going to be happy? So for example, for me, a symbol that represents me would be books. You can see I'm sitting in front of one of my bookshelves here. The reason I say that is because, I have books. So it's not about if I got that one book that everything would be fine. It's just the symbol of books to me mean knowledge, and it means an escape. So for me, the symbol of books is really important because it symbolizes my love for the English language. I've always loved reading and writing, and I think that everything is better with a good story. So when I think about what would be a good symbol for Miss Monroe, I just think of a book, and it could be any book. I mean, I like sci-fi and fantasy and things like that the best. But a book to me represents who I am because you open it up and it can take you to another world, right? And that's why I love books so much, because you can lose yourself into this sort of escapism. And I think that's why books are so important, and that's why it would be a good symbol for me. For the creative option, I'd like you guys to think about writing a little story, not long, half a page or a page, based on this story, Thank You Ma'am. So one thing I was thinking was in the story at the very beginning, it starts out with Roger and Mrs. Jones literally running into each other on the street as he's trying to kind of grab her purse. So I'd like you guys to write a short interaction between two people who suddenly meet on the street. Like, who are these people? They're probably quite different based on the differences between Roger and Mrs. Jones when we first meet them. And then later on, we discover that they actually have quite a lot in common. So I'd like you to think about the setting of on the street and two random people meeting, and who might these people be? One more thing that you might want to add is try to make the story have a little bit of that situational irony that I talked about. So in Thank You, Ma'am, the ending is ironic because Mrs. Jones treats Roger completely differently from how you would expect in the beginning. So if you're able to think of a way to make your story ironic, for example, have an unexpected ending, or have the people talk and interact in a way that's a little bit different from what we might expect, then that's a way to try to use irony in a way in your own writing. And it doesn't have to be obvious, like some crazy twist at the end. It can just be in the simple ways that people talk to each other and how they interact that's maybe a little bit unexpected, right? Because we don't want our writing to be too predictable. We don't want to have the same structure all the time of like two people meet and they have a conversation and they say goodbye. You know, what's something different that you can throw in there? What's something that would make the story stand out, to be a little bit more creative, to be a little bit unexpected? And that's what we're looking for, right? We want you to surprise us a little bit with your writing from time to time. So think about situational irony and of things turning out to be different from what one would expect, right? We want to expect the unexpected here and see if you can come up with an idea that maybe you can develop more a little bit later, of how you can incorporate irony into this story about two people meeting on the street. Okay, so give that a go and see what you think. And just one more little option, if you find the idea of writing irony difficult, which it can be, you know, if you don't have a good idea for that, if you'd like to try and write a short scene between two people meeting on the street, one more technique that you can try is the dialogue itself. So you'll notice in Langston Hughes' story, the way that Roger and Mrs. Jones speak, it's written in kind of a dialect. For example, instead of Roger saying, "Yes, ma'am," or "Yes, Mrs. Jones," he says, "Yes'm," right? Which is a short form for ma'am. Um, and there's lots of examples of that because these are two African American characters. It takes place in a city, so there's sort of this urban African American dialect and slang to the way that they speak. That's very specific to the way that Langston Hughes wrote and the time and the place in which he was writing. So if you'd like to try to write some dialogue as well, it's always good practice in terms of thinking, how can I make these two people sound real? You know what I mean? How can they sound like they're real people actually talking to each other and not characters in a story? You know, you want to try and think of where are they talking, what's taking place, you know, you want to think of the setting and the time. For example, is this taking place, you know, in Thorncliffe Park in 2020? Is it taking place 10 years ago in another country? How would the people actually be talking to each other? And that's something just to think about that you can work on with your writing, is how to make dialogue sound very realistic. And it's not easy, but it's certainly something to kind of consciously try to do. So if you don't want to try for this sort of situational irony of, you know, a twist ending or something like that, if that seems too ambitious, just work on writing a few lines of dialogue and seeing if you can make these two characters really come alive. This is something we did, you know, back in September and October with the short stories, but I want you to revisit it now, if you'd like to, and look at how dialogue can really make a story come alive. You can write a whole story that's mostly dialogue, which this story was, and it can tell a story really well. So think about how to make your dialogue as realistic as possible. If you need to, you can use slang or colloquialisms, or just the way that people talk. Try and write down the real way that people talk in your quick write and see what comes out. Well, that's it for me. I'd like you guys to do your best with your quick writes and just keep completing them in your own time. I believe this is lesson number 5. So there's been 5 different video lessons. There'll be another one posted later this week. And when you guys have the time to sit down and watch these lessons and to do these quick writes, just do the best you can, right? We're just trying to get you to interact with the English class as much as you feel comfortable, and to just keep in touch with you and to give you some things to do that involve reading and writing, which are obviously the most important skills for Miss Longpre and I that we're going to try to impart to you. They're really important to us, and you can probably see that through the way that we recommend books to you and the way that we talk about reading and writing in a way that is very passionate for us. So if you're able to enjoy some of these stories and take some of these book recommendations and run with them, then we're happy. So have a great day, and we'll see you online soon. Bye.